When your mind won't stop talking, it usually doesn't start with something dramatic. It starts quietly, almost politely, like a door you didn't realize was slightly open. You lie down thinking you're just going to rest for a bit, maybe close your eyes for a few minutes, maybe scroll through nothing until your body finally gives up and falls asleep on its own. But the moment the room gets still, the mind notices. It notices the lack of distraction. It notices that there's nothing pulling your attention outward anymore. And so it begins to turn inward, gently at first, then all at once, like someone finally remembering everything they've been avoiding all day. A thought appears, then another. And then suddenly it feels like your mind is no longer a quiet place you live in, but a crowded room you can't leave. At first, the thoughts don't even feel like thoughts. They feel like echoes, small fragments of conversations, tiny clips of memory, things you thought didn't matter until this exact moment. Something someone said earlier. Something you said that you wish you could take back. Something you didn't say that you keep replaying differently each time. And then, without warning, your mind starts reaching further back, pulling moments you didn't even know were still there. A place you haven't been to in years. A version of yourself you thought you outgrew. A version of yourself you're not even sure you recognize anymore. And all of it begins to move at once, like the past and present are no longer separate, but layered on top of each other, talking over each other, competing for attention in the same small space inside your head. You try to slow it down, you tell yourself to stop thinking, you tell yourself it's late, that you need rest, that none of this matters right now. But the mind doesn't respond to urgency the way the body does. In fact, urgency only makes it louder. The more you try to control it, the more it resists. One thought turns into a chain, and the chain turns into a spiral, and suddenly you're not just thinking anymore. You're inside the thinking. You're no longer observing it from a distance. You're standing in the middle of it, surrounded by it, like you accidentally walked into a place that was already in motion long before you arrived. And this is where it starts to feel personal. Because the thoughts don't stay neutral. They begin to question you. They replay mistakes. They highlight uncertainties. They bring up things you didn't resolve, conversations you didn't finish, feelings you didn't fully understand. And they do it in a tone that feels urgent, like everything must be solved right now, at this exact moment, or something will be lost forever. But nothing actually needs solving at 2 a.m. The mind just doesn't know how to stop searching. It confuses silence with unfinished business and rest with something dangerous, something incomplete. So you lie there, physically still, but mentally moving through layers of time. And the strangest part is how real it feels. Even though you are safe, even though nothing is happening in the room, your inner world begins to behave like everything is happening at once. You might even start to feel like sleep is something you have to earn by finishing all of these thoughts, as if rest is waiting on the other side of mental completion. But thoughts don't end neatly. They don't arrive with conclusions. They loop, they repeat, they reshape themselves, and if you wait for them to finish, you will stay awake forever. There is a moment, though, somewhere in the middle of all of this, where something subtle begins to change. It doesn't feel like relief at first. It feels like noticing. You notice that you are aware of the thoughts instead of being fully inside them. You notice that there is a part of you that is watching all of this happen, not judging it, not fixing it, just observing it. And that small distance, even if it feels fragile, is important. Because it means you are not the thoughts themselves. You are the awareness of them. You are the space they are moving through, not the thing being consumed by them. But even knowing that doesn't immediately make the noise stop. The mind continues its conversation. It continues to replay, to imagine, to predict, to question. It brings up future scenarios that don't exist yet. It brings up past moments that cannot be changed. It builds entire emotional landscapes out of things that are not happening in this room, in this moment, in this breath. And yet, your body reacts as if they are real, because the body doesn't distinguish between imagined stress and actual stress very well. It just responds, it tightens, it stays alert, it refuses to fully surrender to sleep because, in its own way, it thinks it is protecting you. So you remain in this strange state where rest is available but not accessible, like standing at the edge of something you can see but cannot step into. And in that space, something simple becomes important again: the breath. Not as a technique, not as a solution, but just as something that is still happening without your permission, without your effort, without needing you to manage it, in and out, steady in its own rhythm, unaffected by the urgency in your thoughts. You don't need to control it. You don't need to deepen it. You only need to notice that it is still there, still continuing, even while everything else feels unstable. And slowly, something begins to shift in how the thoughts behave, not because they disappear, but because they lose their grip on your attention. A thought still appears, but it doesn't pull you in as deeply. Another one follows, but it feels slightly more distant, like you are hearing it from another room instead of inside your own head. The volume doesn't always change, but your relationship to the volume does. And that change is what begins to soften the experience. It doesn't silence the mind, but it reduces the urgency of listening to everything it says. At some point, you might realize that the mind has always been like this. Always talking, always generating, always creating meaning, even when none is needed. And you don't have to fight that. You don't have to stop it. You don't have to fix it before you rest. Because rest was never meant to depend on a quiet mind. If that were the requirement, very few people would ever sleep. Instead, rest happens when you stop engaging with every thought as if it requires a response. When you allow the mind to continue speaking, but you no longer answer every sentence it offers. And there is something deeply relieving about that realization, even if it doesn't arrive as a dramatic moment. It comes softly, almost like a settling inside you, like something unclenches, like something stops trying so hard. You are still here, still aware, still thinking, but less attached to the idea that you must follow every thought to its conclusion. And in that space, your body begins to take over in its own quiet way. The weight of it becomes noticeable, the heaviness of your arms, your legs, the subtle sinking into the surface beneath you, gravity doing its work without asking for permission. The mind may continue to talk, but it starts to feel less like a command and more like background noise. Like a distant radio left on in another room of a house you are no longer actively moving through. And you don't need to turn it off. You don't need to fix the house. You just stop walking toward the sound. You stay where you are. You remain still. And slowly, the importance of what the mind is saying begins to fade. Even the thoughts themselves start to lose structure. They become less like clear sentences and more like fragments drifting in and out of focus. A concern that once felt urgent now feels less defined. A memory that once carried weight now feels like it belongs to a different time, a different version of you. And the future, which once felt heavy with uncertainty, begins to feel less immediate, less demanding. Everything is still there, but nothing is pressing against you in the same way anymore. This is often where sleep begins to approach, not as something you force, but as something that happens when attention no longer resists it. You don't fall asleep because you solved anything. You fall asleep because you stopped holding everything at once, because you stopped treating every thought like it needed to be completed before you could rest, because you allowed the night to be unfinished without seeing it as a problem. And if sleep doesn't come immediately, that is also part of the process. Because even rest without sleep is still rest when the mind is no longer in conflict. Lying here, breathing, existing, without needing to fix the moment, is already a form of easing. Already a form of release. Already enough for the body to begin softening its grip on wakefulness. So you don't need to rush it. You don't need to chase sleep like it is something escaping you. You don't need to negotiate with your thoughts or convince your mind to be quiet. You only need to remain here as you are without adding anything extra to this moment. And in time, without announcement, without effort, the mind begins to slow not because it was forced to stop, but because it no longer needs to keep holding your attention so tightly. And somewhere in that quiet shift, you stop waiting for sleep as something distant, and instead begin to notice that you are already halfway inside it.